Does anyone have a question that they want to ask while we're here? Mike Nelson, you are recognized. What is your question?
What are the three organizations we have to pay the closest attention to when it comes to digital trade? In other words,
organizations.
Who's writing the best stuff and making the most important
decisions? Me!
After CW.
Martha! The International Trade Commission is.
Okay, that's one.
I'm going to let the panelists speak. Rachel, do you want to start?
Sure, in terms of who's writing research or setting the actual rules?
Who's actually having an impact on this issue?
Okay, sure. Well, for international organizations, I'd say the OECD Digital Trade reports that they've been working on the past few years out of the Trade Committee have been excellent. They've been substantive and data-driven, so that's certainly a place to look. I would reiterate that the ITC is doing fantastic work. Their global digital trade reports in the past few years have been great. And just in terms of one to also pay attention to is, of course, the WTO submissions that are being put forth in the context of the e-commerce discussions. So that's my three.
Good morning, everyone. Or afternoon now. I'm Matthew, and I would not disagree with any of those. They're all great. The European Center for International Political Economy is doing some of the best quantitative modeling of digital trade's benefits and costs of barriers. That's what I'd add.
Since I represent consumers, and since we are talking about Europeans, I would say European Consumer Organization. They have been doing like great amount of work on this, and also Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue. Like, we have a resolution, and I brought it here, and I'm going to talk about it.
Yeah, I don't think I can think of other ones to add.
That's fair.
Thank you, Commissioner Broadbent. Okay. So, hi everybody, I'm Susan Aaronson, and before I give a general introduction to this event, I'd like to introduce Kyle Renner, who directs the Institute for International Economic Policy. He's our manager of operations, and he's going to give you a brief welcome.
Yes. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Susan mentioned, my name is Kyle Renner. I manage the Institute for International Economic Policy. We're your local host here, and it's our pleasure to welcome you to the LA School for International Affairs here at the George Washington University. This program is part of an ongoing series of activities that we have been working on, broadly speaking, related to global economic governance in the 21st century, which is one of our signature initiatives here at the Institute for International Economic Policy. I would encourage you to find out more about our work by taking a quick look at our website. You can just Google IIEP and GWU. You can also follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @IIEPGW. If you are interested, on a technical note, if you are interested in connecting to the Wi-Fi while you are here, please use the GW Connect network. That will give you 72 hours worth of access. If you have not previously created an account, underneath the login information where you would sign in, you'll see a short message that says create an account here. So I would encourage you to please be tweeting about the event, posting about the event. That way those who are not here are able to join in the conversation. We are also live streaming the event. So if you would like to join along, please use the hashtag digital trade hashtag. Without further ado, thank you very much, Susan. I'll turn the podium back over to you.
Okay. So I would like to just thank the people that made this possible. The Koch Foundation provided the funding, the Internet Society, Washington, D.C. chapter, the Internet Policy Forum, and the Computer and Communications Industry Association, along with the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, and the Institute for International Economic Policy. God, that's a mouthful. All organized this event, and I'm really grateful to them. All right, so I thought we could start with a little Jeopardy. Okay, and everybody knows Jeopardy, right? It's a TV game show where one can win a lot of money. And so they give you the clues, and then you have to take the clue and turn it into a question. So I'm just going to do this slide because I really want to get to our panelists. Who can tell me the question, goods and services delivered online? Let's play a little Jeopardy. Anybody? Anybody? 10,000. Yes, ma'am.
What is digital trade?
Wrong. Mr. Nelson.
What is e-commerce?
Fair enough.
Does that mean I'm right?
No, you are right. Yeah. Excuse me, let me try that again. Yes, you are right. $10,000. Okay. Okay, the next question. Dean Brinkerhoff, do you want to give that a try?
What is digital trade?
Yay!
Thank you, I made whole.
$12,000. So barriers or impediments to digital trade, including, I know that, oh God, including censorship, filtering, data or server location measures and regulations to protect privacy.
What is Susan Aaronson working on?
Good guess, not correct. Yes, sir. Nope.
What are non-tariff trade barriers?
That could actually be correct, except it's not the right answer.
Okay.
But yes, that is correct. Real quick, anybody? Yes.
What are technical barriers to trade?
Could you reframe that?
Probably not. In my world, that means something.
Yeah, yeah. What world is that? It is the world of digital what? I'll give you a hint. Trump. Trump believes in
Trade warfare.
it begins with a P, guys. Okay, what is digital protectionism? Except that that's also not the right answer. What does the US ITC define as digital protectionism? Okay, real quick, the second one is barriers to cross-border data shows that regulate computing, data localization, prohibit storage processing, and or make cross-border data contingent upon use of computing facilities or network elements. Personal data protection is not a barrier. What is the relevant question here? To save time, I'm going to answer it for you and give myself $15,000. What is the EU definition of digital protectionism? The point being that there are no shared definitions for what we're even talking about here today, which is why we desperately need these panelists. And so we're going to begin with Rachael Stelly of CCIA, and I'm not going to give her extensive bio or any of the speakers because you have that handout. Okay, Rachel.
Hi everyone, my name is Rachael Stelly. I serve as policy counsel for the Computer and Communications Industry Association. CCIA is a trade association. Is my mic on?
Get close.
Better? No. I don't know how close I can get. Okay. CCI is a trade association. We represent internet and technology service providers. Our members export services around the world and are relied on by users and businesses around the world. CCI believes that there is an urgent need to update the international trade framework to recognize the digitalization of the world economy. Today, international commerce is intertwined with the internet. Every firm that exports around the world is a digital company, whether it frames itself that way or not. As this trend continues, global trade rules should reflect the needs of this digital economy. Regardless of size, internet firms and those who utilize these services export need rules that provide certainty and lower barriers to trade. This isn't something that's new. Trade has always provided a key role in expanding market access for businesses of all sizes to export to new markets. Something that is new is that these traditional companies are increasingly relying on technology and the internet to export abroad. And as such, it's not just tech firms or firms that you would consider digital and tech that stand to benefit from these rules. Right now, countries are looking at how they want to treat trade and digital issues in their own trade agreements. Given how important the digital trade is to the U.S. economy, it is quite concerning that the U.S. right now does not have an enforceable trade agreement that has a comprehensive approach to digital trade rules. We certainly don't want to risk other countries stepping in to take that leadership position, considering how different countries view the internet and its role in providing an open dialogue. There are certainly prior agreements that CCIA believes that touch on digital priorities, such as previous trade agreements that have intellectual property chapters and customs and trade facilitation. However, this lack of a comprehensive approach is a limit to how effective U.S. trade rules can be. We really missed the boat with the Trans-Pacific Partnership that had an e-commerce chapter. However, to USTR's credit, the renegotiation of the North America Free Trade Agreement provided a key opportunity for the U.S. to really get a second chance at setting these rules. USMCA, which is the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, provides a comprehensive digital trade chapter, and from our perspective, it's the gold standard for how the U.S. should pursue digital trade rules. We're encouraged that this seems to be the template going forward. It was included in the U.S.-Japan Digital Trade Agreement, and it also seems to be something that the U.S. is pursuing on the multilateral level at the World Trade Organization in the context of these ongoing e-commerce discussions. I'm sure my panelists will talk more about what is in the USMCA that will really provide certainty for U.S. internet services. However, one thing that I do want to touch on is this inclusion of Article 19.17 that pertains for protections for what the agreement calls interactive computer services. This language is similar to what you may have heard as the Section 230 provisions in the Telecommunications Act of 1996. These provisions have incentivized internet services to proactively remove content that violates terms of service as well as is illegal or violates U.S. law. As the law was characterized by its own drafters, Section 230 gives internet services a sword to use against abusive content while also providing a shield or a limitation on liability, providing legal certainty to services of all sizes operating online. These provisions have been critical for international competitiveness and global U.S. tech leadership. We do believe that how governments approach regulation of content online as a trade issue. This is especially critical as countries are looking at how they want to regulate content and are increasingly pursuing regulations. U.S. firms operating as intermediaries face an increasingly hostile environment in a variety of international markets, which impedes U.S. internet services and their users from expanding services abroad. That said, while ostensibly in pursuit of noble goals of tackling illegal content online, what we're seeing is that a number of these proposals are quite broad and in a number of occasions could conflict with U.S. law and free expression values. And this affects not only intermediaries themselves, but the users that rely on their services around the world. And then one other thing to flag is that these concerns are exasperated by a number of recent court decisions in national courts about the application of global injunctions to this content. So how countries start regulating content might not have a national implication, but also international approach if courts are demanding that content is removed worldwide. And then finally, to expand on why digital trade rules are so critical in the light of barriers, we had put a two-pager on sign-in just about the digital trade barriers that CCIA is focused on. This is a well-timed discussion because today was the deadline for the USTR's comments on the National Trade Estimates report. This is an annual report that the USTR will release in the spring, and it really is a comprehensive overview of all barriers that U.S. industry are facing when exporting to new markets. And in recent years, USTR has included digital trade as a focus, as a component of these reports. So CCIA filed comments today explaining these barriers. The major ones are identified in the two-pager, but the document itself is over 90 pages, so that just gives you an overview of how active these countries are on these issues. And a number of these issues can be addressed by clear and consistent trade rules, either bilaterally on a multilateral basis. As countries do step up regulatory scrutiny on the digital economy, trade will play an important role in ensuring that national regulations are not inconsistent with international obligations and don't discriminate against U.S. firms. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Our next speaker is Matthew Reisman, who is the Director of Trade Policy for a company you might have heard of called Microsoft.
Thank you so much, Susan. Can you hear me? So first I just want to say, Susan, Mike was absolutely right in the answer to your first question. You are one of the leading scholars on digital trade, and everybody should read Susan's work if you haven't. But I'm really humbled today to be with you because as I look around the room, I see so many folks who are leaders on digital trade, both in research and in policy. And I can't go on without calling out a few. Former Commissioners Broadbent and Pearson, who I had the honor of working for and with at the ITC. Martha, who leads much of the work still today at the ITC on digital trade. Mike Nelson, a former colleague who's a great scholar on this and practitioner. And I want to point out Rory in the corner here from the Senate, who has led with great passion a lot of really creative policy work in this area. So don't just listen to us, listen to, find a time to talk to everyone in the room. And the other thing I wanted to say, Susan, is I really appreciate that you always try to bring diverse voices to your panels. We don't always see that, both in perspectives, affiliations, and gender, and thank you for that. So look, I'm happy to spend as much time as you want today going back and forth on the weeds of digital trade policy, but before we do any of that, I think it's worth stepping back to say, why do we care about this in the first place? I mean, does it really matter? I think the first thing that people would assume I might talk about, and maybe it's the first thing you would think about, is commerce and is trade. And yes, absolutely, these technologies like artificial intelligence and cloud computing are making things possible with productivity and with ability to reach customers that we never could before in every industry, whether it's agriculture, whether it's farmers who now have IoT sensors in the ground, whether it's manufacturers who are more productive than they ever were before because they can align their operations around the globe in real time, or financial services reaching people in the most remote corners of countries and continents that were underbanked before. It's all true, but it goes way beyond that. We're here at one of the world's premier educational institutions. A place like GW can reach students it never could before because of data flows, because people on the other side of the screen can sit in a lecture that they would have had to come to Washington, D.C. before. One of my favorite examples is in healthcare. So I am not a healthcare practitioner, but I'm honored to work at a company that does a lot in the healthcare space. So for example, you may not know this, but if Microsoft's research lab was a computer science department of a university, it would be the largest computer science department in the world. It's headquartered in Redmond, Washington, but it also has branches all around the world. And these folks, frankly, are connected together and working every day because of the magic of these data flows. Now, one of the projects that they're working on is called Project Inner Eye. So what this does is it has, so I'm not a radiologist, but the way, as I understand it, when a radiologist is trying to treat a tumor, they have to look at image after image after image of tissue to try and separate the healthy tissue from the cancerous tissue. That can take weeks for one radiologist to do. Now, with the magic of machine learning, our scientists have been working on ways to help radiologists to be able to analyze thousands of images that would have taken weeks in minutes and to be able to target that treatment. That's saving people's lives. And that, to me, is where data flows become really interesting. So I totally agree with Rachel that there's some important things in the USMCA that we hadn't seen before, that we've needed to see in trade agreements for a long time. TPP did set a great foundation. To me, it's both rules that allow people to access technologies they couldn't before, which is this ability to access data flows across borders, limitations on data localization. But equally important, nobody's going to use our technologies if they don't trust them. And they shouldn't. And they shouldn't. And that's why what's been really promising to us is that we saw it in TPP, we saw it even more in USMCA, are really robust provisions on privacy and on cybersecurity, encouraging good practice and cooperation across these areas. We've got to have those for digital trade to move forward. I do want to say, with all the tumult in trade policy, something really good on digital trade happened a few weeks ago. This is the U.S.-Japan agreement, which we do actually have many of the provisions in USMCA, really most of them on digital trade, are now part of that agreement, and that is something to be celebrated, even if many of us would love to see those applied more broadly across the region, and maybe one day we still will. And I appreciated the mention of the WTO. We see that as a really exciting opportunity for spreading of these really robust rules, both increasing trust and access to technology on a broader scale. There are now 80 countries talking about reaching a new digital trade agreement. We'd love to see that come to completion. Who knows, maybe even by the next ministerial of the WTO in June next year. So maybe I'll leave it there and pass it on to Burcu. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Burcu Kilic is the Director of Digital Rights at Public Citizen, and she is an expert on IP and personal data protection.
Yeah. Thank you, Susan. Before I start, I want to give where credit is due. Like, I've been working with Susan since 2015, since the TPP, and she always includes me to her panels because that's not very common to see like consumers and the consumer advocates on the panels related to digital trade. Thank you, Susan. And I really appreciate the opportunity. So I'm going to talk about consumers, and I'm going to try to share the consumer perspective about this issue. So why consumer perspective is important? Because we talk about digital trade, and digital trade or e-commerce, like people still talk about e-commerce in Geneva, it's all about data. You know, it's a data economy, digital economy. And most of the time, this data is our personal data. So like the data traveling across the borders, data pioneering all these new services, it's our personal data. So it becomes personal. And that's why it's important to have consumers and the consumer perspective on the table. So I have a very short presentation showing some of, okay, this can.
Bear with us, we're just learning how to use PowerPoint.
Yeah, I decided very last minute because I have some documents related to the issue. So, as I mentioned, when we talk about digital trade, we talk about personal data, and most of the time they tell you, no, it's B2B data, and I ask them, explain me B2B data, and we always end up with the personal data. So the issue is personal data, and we are talking about personal data pioneering all these services. And then consumers become relevant. We have a consumer dialogue, transatlantic consumer dialogue. It is the dialogue of like 80 consumer advocacy organizations across the pond. Both in the US and the EU, it includes most of the consumer advocacy organizations, but also the digital rights groups. And we issued this resolution back in January when a joint initiative statement Joint Statement Initiative launched the negotiations on plurilateral negotiations on e-commerce at the WTO, and we had three main recommendations. Like one of our first recommendations was transparency and proactive engagement with the legislator and stakeholders and citizens. This is not the first trade agreement we've been working on, and it won't be the last. But some things have to change. And then we asked the negotiators or the delegates and the policymakers, please put the consumers at the forefront because this is about us, this is our data. And then we also asked them to recognize that trade deals are not appropriate to tackle every aspect of digital policy. So we have some red lines and some green lines. So when we talk about like digital right or e-commerce back in Geneva, everyone is talking about e-commerce. we want like digital trade or e-commerce to enhance consumer trust in digital markets. Matthew pointed out a very important point here. Like, if there is no consumer trust, there is no digital trade. It is a precondition for digital trade. So how will you enhance it? You need to provide, we want the digital trade providers to provide adequate information. We want redress and dispute resolution. Like, online payments is a really, really important issue for consumers and competitive telecom markets. But then we have red lines, which we identified as data protection, net neutrality, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity. And I'm gonna talk about a few of them. And then we also have advice for the regulators, because we do work globally, and when we talk to the regulators, we always have the same problem. There is no cooperation and coordination between the regulators, and it's very important for consumers that consumer authorities and the competition authorities, they cooperate and coordinate. So, as I said, there are few red lines. And one of the most important red lines for us is the data protection or the privacy issue. And we know that when we talk about digital trade, we talk about data flows. And data flows is important. But data flows is also important for consumers. I don't know how many of you have teenage kids. How many of you have teenage kids? 2, 3. Are you concerned about TikTok? Yeah. So, my kids are still young, so I'm not concerned about their use of TikTok, but I know many people who have teenage kids, and they are extremely concerned about TikTok. Why? Because TikTok is a Chinese company. And when I talk to my colleagues, they always tell me that, yeah, the data flows to China. We don't know what happens. And I ask them, so do you know what happens to your data in the US? So that's a problem. That's an issue for consumers. As US consumers now, we are concerned about TikTok. We are concerned about our data flowing to China. But for a long time, Europeans were concerned about their data flowing to the US because they had all these rights and protections in the EU, and they didn't necessarily know how they were protected in the US. So back in 2015, when the TPP e-commerce chapter was released, we commissioned this research as Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue to the University of Amsterdam. We asked the law professors, trade law professors there, and we told them, look, here is the data flows provision, here is the exception. Can you please tell us whether these exceptions are strong enough? And they said, no, these exceptions are not strong enough. And at that time, we didn't, the Europeans or European allies, they didn't even have the GDPR. And they said, these exceptions are not good enough, they are not strong enough, and it's not very clear whether the privacy rules will pass these exceptions. And what happened? The European Parliament took this issue very seriously, and the European Commission, the European Commission didn't have a position, and it took a while for European Commission to identify a position on data flows, and they finally came up with that position last year, and which is highly controversial for the US and for other TPP countries. So we call trade and privacy as complicated bedfellows. And then another issue, particularly concerning for us, is source code and algorithm issue. This source code, the protection of source code provision first appeared in the TPP just out of blue in the e-commerce chapter, and we were very confused because it's an intellectual property issue. When we talk about the source code provision, we talk about trade secrets. And then I asked the negotiators at that time, because I was following the TPP very closely because of the intellectual property chapter, and I asked the negotiators, what is this provision? What is the purpose of this provision? And it became clear that it was a Japanese proposal. When Japan joined the TPP, they brought this proposal, and then they asked the IP negotiators, do you want to have this provision? And the IP negotiator said, like, we have enough problems. Don't give us another problem. So we ended up with the source code provision, but it became like a, it became part of the US template. And at the USMCA, the scope has been broadened to include algorithms. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about source code, algorithms, but also the training material and other relevant materials regarding regarding the technology. So the concern is, like, we want algorithmic transparency. We want algorithmic accountability. And you will say, there are exceptions, but there are exceptions for the courts, there are exceptions for the regulators, but there are no exceptions for the researchers or the consumer advocacy organizations like us. And there was a very recent research about the algorithms which is used at the healthcare, like which determines which patients are risky, and there was a very, very strong racial bias. The researchers identified, and it came out this week. And in the paper, they said that we have a problem because we can't have access to source code, algorithms, and the training material, and it's very, very hard for us to conduct this research. So the future, future of algorithms, future of artificial intelligence is about researchers and the consumer advocacy organizations like us doing the checks and doing the investigations on this technology. But we don't have access to the source code, algorithms, and training material. So it is a concern for us. So when we talk about digital trade, we talk about like data collection, data mining, data analysis, and it's very problematic. And for a long time in the US, we ignored that. But the recent scandals made it clear that we have a problem here. We need privacy, we need data protection rules. So, and everyone on this panel, I know that they somehow, we all agree that we need protections, we need a law. We don't necessarily agree on the details, but we need a federal privacy law. So, and we have like a big monopoly problem. That's why we have all these investigations going on. The status quo is like, when you look at the US, no regulations, no protections, no rights, and the data flows to the US. That's why the other countries are highly concerned about that. But there's a growing consumer awareness, and the consumers are highly, highly concerned, which requires creative thinking economically, legally, and politically. Last but not least, speaking of creative thinking, we have a small alliance, which consists of few of the digital rights groups and the consumer advocacy groups, and that's what we are trying to come up with some of the analysis, and we have I brought this. We have a resolution of TCD, Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue on Digital Trade, and I have some copies. And we have a document about the consumer's view. So we are trying to bring the consumer voice to the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Burcu. Our final speaker. Well, that's not completely true. Our fourth speaker is Commissioner Broadbent. Meredith Broadbent just recently retired from the U.S. International Trade Commission, and she's a non-resident senior fellow at CSIS, a Washington think tank, but I'm hoping she'll join the hub, too.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate it. Happy Halloween, everybody. Luckily, all the candy got bought before the U.S. Court of International Trade invalidated the suspension agreement on trade with sugar in Mexico. Oh, that was the old trade world. And we're talking now about the new trade world, which is really interesting and complicated, as you can see from the people on the panel, and lacking in overall governance at this point. As a former chairman and commissioner of the International Trade Commission, I'm proud to say that I oversaw a big sort of digital transformation at the ITC, which analyzes the competitiveness of U.S. workers and firms in the global economy. At the request of the Senate Finance Committee and USTR Froman, During the time I was there, we issued 5 groundbreaking studies on how digitization is transforming international competitiveness of the United States economy. The agency made dramatic strides in developing new analytical expertise in growing markets for interconnected devices, including smart manufacturing, cloud computing, e-commerce, internet search, and digital trade. Martha Lawless, who led most of this research, or a lot of it, is in the audience, and we're glad to have her here. Developing this analytical capability and new relationships with industry, workers, and NGO groups was exciting for a 100-year-old agency that has traditionally focused on serving constituencies of manufacturing, steel, chemicals, and labor. And I think it reflects the growing awareness in Congress of the need for more information and analysis on the trends in the U.S. economy that is represented by the new technology. Speaking as an old USTR trade negotiator, the digital economy creates enormous wealth for Americans and makes our trading partners anxious to tax, tariff, and regulate it for many public policy purposes. I would argue if we are going to keep our workers employed productively in the economy of the fourth industrial revolution, we need to understand what makes the United States overwhelmingly globally competitive and the role that data flows has played in that success. The United States has a huge lead internationally in harnessing digitization for the prosperity of our people, and we should negotiate international agreements with the goal of preserving this international competitiveness. Just to talk a little bit about the stage on the trade negotiations, and I think the point that was made here by the question from the audience is there's not one stage, there's many different fora internationally where people are trying to grapple with the digital trade issue. And in the WTO, there's a plurilateral global trade agreement that's proceeding. Negotiations are ongoing right now. And writ large, looking at a high level, the main issues emerging for trade policy is different regulation of data flows for a wide variety of public policy purposes, and the freedom to impose tariffs on digital transmissions. And this is against the backdrop of what the Financial Times had recently described as splinternet, where we're fragmentation of internet governance defined by 3 competing zones, Europe and GDPR, China, which asserts pretty heavy government control and limitations on free speech and free flow of information, in the United States, which at this point has relatively less regulation. Unlike international trade in goods, which is governed by familiar agreed principles of non-discrimination, national treatment, and least trade restrictive, given domestic regulatory objectives, the governance of electronic transmissions and digital trade through permanent binding obligations is relatively weak. Tried and true WTO rules of fair trade for goods do not yet exist for international digital exchanges. The temporary exception to this is the WTO's customs duties moratorium on electronic transmissions, which is a mouthful, and it's commonly referred to as the e-commerce moratorium, which is next set to expire in December of 2019, maybe in June, depending on how the December meeting goes. Through successive extensions of the temporary moratorium on in two-year increments, the moratorium has been an element of WTO rules since 1998. Recently, however, developing countries have increased their opposition to extending the moratorium. So there will be probably some developments this year and early next year in that decision making. As was mentioned before, U.S. bilateral free trade agreements have contained commitments not to impose duties on e-commerce transactions probably for over about 15 years. As we've negotiated different bilateral free trade agreements. And then the USMCA pending in Congress contains digital trade commitments that were first agreed to in TPP and then have been implemented through the leadership of Japan in the new CPTPP. And then they were also replicated in the most recent U.S.-Japan bilateral agreement. The USMCA Digital Trade Chapter, which is basically this language, builds on TPP language and adds more specific details in areas of free data flows, data localization, digital services, safe harbor for copyright liability, customs facilitation, and workable privacy provisions. So there's a lot going on just on the traditional trade agenda. As the WTO has a group of 76 countries that are negotiating under what is called the Joint Statement Initiative on Electronic Commerce, and they just met last week. I understand that UNCTAD had a meeting in April in Geneva to talk about a lot of these issues and kind of draw out and educate, hear what developing countries were thinking. APEC, until it was canceled, was going to discuss some privacy things, I think, in November in Chile. So that's another fora that seems to have a role in this. But in December in Geneva, WTO members, it's mid-December, WTO members will consider expiration of this e-commerce moratorium that I mentioned. And that's a lot of other things will be swirling at that time, the access to medicines moratorium, which I know Bruce knows a lot about, and possible dissolution of the WTO appellate body, and sort of preparations for this ministerial that's been decided on for June 8th in Kazakhstan, where a lot of these issues will continue to be discussed. So there's a lot going on in the next 6 to 7 months that I think folks looking at digital trade will want to take note of. Just talking a little bit about ITC research, and I'll just abbreviate this. There is a new generation of digital trade barriers out there that's likely to become more costly and troublesome for U.S. companies in the future, starting with the expiration of this e-commerce moratorium. We did a lot of, the agency did a lot of research focusing on surveys of U.S. companies, very kind of lengthy surveys just to sort of probe what kind of problems they were finding in international markets. And number one was the data restrictions on data storage, localization, restrictions on cross-border data flows, privacy rules like GDPR in the EU. Secondly, technical standards were mentioned, specific national standards beyond those developed by International Standards Organization, cryptography standards, testing and certification requirements, lots of IPR problems for source code and search algorithm disclosure, forced technology transfer, rampant digital piracy, especially of music and video. And companies also mentioned ownership restrictions for foreign direct investment, such as 49% caps, local content requirements, hardware components or cultural content restrictions, investment monitoring restrictions, and then other market access barriers, low de minimis levels, censorship, filtering, commercial licensing delays. So U.S. businesses running up against, a myriad of problems in foreign markets. If the goods world is any example, I think U.S. companies do better if we have an overall agreed set of rules that at least talk about non-discrimination and fair treatment. And my sense would be that would be part of the discussion that we have when NAFTA is considered in Congress, when members talk about the digital trade chapter, because I think it'll be an important precedent just to get on record where generally there is a consensus in the U.S. on some of these issues. So I look forward to any questions and my other comments from the panel members. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we've now heard a wide variety of views about the situation related to digital trade. And in particular, there is no shared consensus regarding what sort of norms should underpin this. right? Meredith just mentioned that U.S. business would very much like to have MFN, national treatment, and sort of the rule of law for digital trade, and yet there aren't shared norms regarding how you govern different types of data, and developing countries really don't know how to govern many different types of data. For example, with the future of AI, to solve big problems, they're going to want to mix public data and personal data, right? If you want to figure out solutions to global warming, for example. But they don't know how to govern that data. A lot of developing countries don't share public data with their public. So the future of this is going to be very difficult. And I prepared a handout on how the U.S. is dealing with this now, which is sector-specific digital economy and digital trade agreements. And maybe that is a way to go. I have no idea. But the point that I want to bring to you is that digital trade is very much a work in progress, and we haven't figured out. There isn't this shared norm or principles to underpin this. With that, end of fetching. Let's hear your questions. Who would like to go first?
Thank you. This is all new to me.
Could you introduce yourself, Dean Brinkerhoff?
Sorry. Yeah, Jennifer Brinkerhoff. I'm on the faculty here in the Elliott School, and this is all very new to me. Clearly, since I lost the first Jeopardy question, but I'm very curious to know, apropos of what you were just saying, Susan, about artificial intelligence and data mining, and we want to protect private data. But a lot of the data could be extremely useful for data mining and machine learning to solve global challenges. And so I just wonder if there's any movement to do some data governance work where you would have some clean, I guess that's not the right word, but databases of information that have cleared private identifiable aspects out so that the data can be used for the public good. Is there anything like that underfoot? Thanks.
Anyone like to take that on?
Yeah, I can take that on. Thank you. That's a very good question, and I think the answer is, in order to give you the right answer, we need to get to the basics. Like as Susan mentioned, data governance is the issue we really need to talk about. And when we talk about data governance, I think the starting point should be like privacy. I mean, I'm going to wear my consumer advocate hat here, but there should be rules about data collection, data processing, and then as people, because when we talk about data, as I said, it's personal data. Even if you say it's the identifiable, it's not. I mean, that's a discussion for 2010. With today's technology, the identifiable data is identifiable for me because I put the data points together. So the technology has improved a lot. That's why we have new challenges. That's why we need regulations for the protection of personal data. We need rules, like what should be the rule for data collections? What should be the rules for data processing? Once we identify that, I think we can build strong systems and we can use this data properly. But without that, it is a challenge. I mean, Matt mentioned the healthcare, and it's a really, really big challenge in healthcare. I mean, we all like to use these technologies, but when we talk about health data, everything is health data now. It's not like your data that you share with your doctor. This is your health data. This is your health data. So there should be rules. There should be what are our rights? You share your data now, but what if you don't want to share it later on? You should be able to withdraw your consent or delete your data out there. We need to talk about the basics. That's why I keep saying that we need to talk about the basics. We really need rules about the collection of data and processing of data. That's why we all want privacy rules.
Please.
I can jump in. I love the question. It rapidly gets into areas that are well outside my expertise, but I think a point that I think is consistent with what you're saying, Burcu, is, look, there's a number of frameworks that need to interact here. One is, look, I don't think anybody on this panel would disagree on the need for robust protection for privacy. I know our company was 15 years ago calling for federal privacy legislation, and we continue to be very assertive on that. It's more important than ever. The needs for what that legislation should cover are very different, perhaps, than 15 years ago as technology continues to evolve. At the same time, I think maybe where there's a point of difference, I think we do see a space for trade rules to try and capture areas where measures are not needed for regulatory purposes, but may lead to trade distortions. And I think we would submit we can do a better job across both those areas when governments are talking to each other about the issues. It would be a mistake to talk about data privacy only among trade negotiators. The key thing is to get people with the right expertise always in the room. The door should be open in that regard. I think the only other piece I'll mention is there's really interesting work in both the private sector, academia, and governments on open data, and this idea that we should be working, all of us together, to figure out what data we can share with each other without locking it up, yet at the same time protecting people's privacy. So, thank you.
Anyone else on the panel want to answer?
Just to add one thing on the open data point, we were encouraged in the USMCA agreement to have commitments that governments share open data in machine-readable format. And so this is an opportunity that a lot of this data, for Susan's example on climate change, that governments are able to share this data without any trade implications on that is critical.
Thank you. Yes, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Megan Clifford. I'm Megan Clifford, Trade Counselor at the Canadian Embassy. I just wanted to pick up on what Matthew was talking about, privacy protection. And, one of the places that we've had some of these discussions is at the WTO. And the WTO happens to had been a forum for real progress in terms of international rules, et cetera, and because of that, and because it tends to be somewhat successful compared to other really big international fora, it's looked at for the resolution of some of these issues. So my question really is, just again picking up, the WTO is someplace where you could talk about data protection, but are there other fora that maybe are more appropriate? And what would the sequencing be then? Because I sort of see data protection as being the primary thing, and then where you maintain and hold that data is second to that. And where do you have those discussions? Where do you create those rules? And then the other thing is, I think this is something the Europeans have given a lot of thought to. The rest of us, more or less, and the U.S. has appeared to be suspicious or not that interested. And so it's a great thing to hear that the U.S. is moving in that direction. I think we see that when we see that Mark Zuckerberg is being cross-examined in hearings and so on. So it's a really evolving thing. So maybe if you could comment on that.
Glad to start, Megan. Thank you for the great question. Certainly, I think we would be the first to say there are lots of other forums besides the WTO that could be helpful and constructive here. I think one that has been for close to 40 years on privacy is the OECD, and it's a forum where you can get people with expertise beyond trade talking about these issues. While APEC has often had trade as a central issue, they have been working on privacy for decades as well, and we are eager to see work in that forum continue. But I welcome other panelists' thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that. I don't think that WTO is the right forum to discuss data protection or privacy, because trade approaches to issues from trade perspective, and it doesn't necessarily protect the users or consumers. And most of the time, I do have lots of conversations with trade negotiators, the trade delegates at the WTO. I mean, the challenge is we have European Union, which has very, very strong rules on privacy and data protection, but that's not the case for most of the countries. They have no rules on privacy. I mean, even if they have rules, the enforcement is really problematic. So you can't expect those countries, like the trade delegates of those countries, to go to the WTO and to protect something they don't have, So they are trying to protect the policy space now, and they are realizing the importance of introducing rules and regulations for data, for the protection of personal data, but they are not there yet, and it will take for most of those countries to get there. That again comes to the point Susan raised, data governance. Most of the countries who've been negotiating these provisions, they don't have strong data governance rules or systems. Some of them have, for instance, Australia, New Zealand, but I know that they are revising their privacy rules because they think that they are not strong enough. So it's a challenge. But OECD is a good forum, and OECD has privacy principles which every country should adopt, including the US. But even for the US, it will take time. It's not going to happen overnight.
I would agree with the OECD and APAC as other forums. To pick up on where the WTO can be helpful in this area, I don't think at present submissions are to draft national privacy laws. Again, but that's just what I know that's public. But one of the key roles that the WTO can play in this area is determining the scope of interoperability, and interoperability plays in these trade discussions, knowing that countries aren't going to have a lot of the same approaches to privacy, even if they agree on standards. The WTO can provide a clear role of how different privacy frameworks can be interoperable with each other.
Next question.
Hello, Dan Pearson with Americans for Prosperity. As the TPP was wrapping up, we ended up with what seemed to me a curious approach to data localization, in which the United States insisted it would apply to financial institutions and not to others. Then the Trump administration, of course, withdrew from TPP, probably not because of the data localization issue, but since then, how has that issue evolved? I mean, is the United States and its financial regulators completely comfortable with no localization requirement? How would you assess that issue?
So if I want to jump in, I can.
Yeah, why don't you go, Matthew?
So look, just to level set for everybody in the room, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there were general rules that said parties shall allow two things. They shall allow data to flow across borders, and they said there shall be no data localization. However, for financial services, banking and other financial services, there was a data flow commitment, but not a commitment on data localization. And for many in the financial services industries or industries that serve them, they were concerned about that this could impede the ability of global financial institutions to use the cloud. And what you saw in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement actually was an effort to bridge that gap. So now they do apply a localization limitation in financial services. And others may be more expert on the language, but let's pipe in. But I think one of the sticking points, why was this an issue in the first place? This gets back to a classic issue when you broaden out the scope of trade rules into areas of domestic regulation. Financial regulators wanted to make sure that at the time of the next crisis, they had ready access to the data they needed to prevent a calamity. And from my understanding, and others may have another view, is while negotiating USMCA, actually a lot of this work started when the U.S. was negotiating a services agreement that was going to be called the TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement. But it was carried forward in USMCA, was an effort to both make sure that need was well accounted for and that regulators were assured access to that data, and at the same time to allow data to limit those localization possibilities. So to our view, and why would Microsoft care about this? We work, to be candid, financial institutions are some of our most important customers in the world. And we see how much more productive they can be and better at serving their customers when they can use the cloud. So other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can just follow up on what Matt said. That was a big issue in the TPP because the TPP e-commerce chapter didn't apply to financial services. And when the TPP text was released, it became one of the hot topics, especially at the Congress. I mean, it was pharmaceuticals and there are other issues, but the financial services issue was a very, very controversial issue. The reason the TPP didn't include any rules of any data localization provision for financial services was the U.S. Treasury at that time had a very strong position on that. And as I mentioned, I attended almost like all the TPP negotiation rounds, and I had a chance to meet the representatives from the U.S. Treasury, and they had a very strong position. And the reason was, like as Matt mentioned, during the 2008 crisis, they didn't really have access to the data because it was back in Hong Kong in Asia. So they wanted to have like access to that data, financial data, when there was a financial crisis. But after the TPP, the U.S. Congress and the Treasury, they found a solution. I don't necessarily remember the details, but as far as I remember, there was a requirement for keeping the copy of the data here so that in case of financial crisis, U.S. Treasury can access, and I think those rules are adopted in the USMCA going forward because the financial industry was very, very concerned about those provisions. But in the meantime, the U.S. Treasury has a strong position too.
Anyone else want to comment? Okay, next question. Who has the mic? Oh, great.
Hi there. Thank you all very much for participating today. My name is Rachael. I'm from Congressional Research Service, and apologies for my voice. But you've already addressed some of the questions I had. But in terms of the WTO, whether you call it the e-commerce plurilateral, the digital trade plurilateral, how do you reconcile doing what the USTR would consider an ambitious agreement, something similar to the USMCA, with the need for inclusion, to include as many members as possible, including those who want to preserve their policy space because they don't yet have their own national rules, whether it's data privacy or otherwise. How do you reconcile that tension, or is there a way to do kind of tiered agreements? Or I'm thinking, like, if you look at the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, there was work on capacity building in different ways that countries who weren't yet ready to take on the commitments were able to sign up for them, even if they said, not yet then, or I need to do it my way. So just curious on the different perspectives on that.
Happy to jump in. I would have called you out, Rachael, at the beginning if I'd recognized you with your hat on there. Rachael has done report after report with CRS on digital trade. So if you're looking for a 101, her reports are terrific in that regard. So look, this is another classic tension in a plurilateral trade. Plurilateral meaning more than one, but not everybody. In trade speak. When you've got a bunch of countries together, there's going to be a give and take between the level of ambition of commitment and how many countries are going to agree to that. I think right now we're at about 80 countries that are participating. That's a pretty big group that's almost half of the WTO members, and quite a diverse range, I would add. I mean, there's some break this down as saying this is a rich country versus developing country dynamic. You've got a bunch of developing countries that are in the room who are at least saying, this looks like something that will benefit us, and we want to see where we can go with it. I think if we're being honest, by the time we get to the finish line with this agreement, I suspect it will be a smaller group. And I hope it's not a lot smaller, because I think we're all better off with these rules. But at the same time, you do want to make sure that what is there is substantive. I think part of what we have to do is give countries the assurance that nothing in the agreement is meant to impinge on their sovereignty and their ability to regulate. And at least to our mind, data rules written right they're not meant to undermine in any way a country's ability to protect their citizens' privacy. They're meant to limit their ability to make rules that are unnecessarily trade restrictive. Now, one can get into a debate about what's necessary or not, but when they work right, I think the concept is correct. And so part of it is an education thing, I think, about what the rules are meant to do and not do, but part of it is accommodating and seeing what's the art of the possible.
Anyone else like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think, developing country participation in the WTO is an age-old issue, and it's been handled a lot of different ways. As a tariff negotiator, I mean, we were able to do, much longer phase-ins for poorer countries. It's always a debate on how you characterize or categorize the countries, and I don't think there's been huge solutions or suggestions put forward yet. I think the U.S. is trying to stick with its original proposal to get that clarified. But it'll be definitely part of the back and forth as they get closer to the end of the negotiation.
Any other comments?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I was in Geneva last month, and I was asking the same question to the trade delegates. So what's the plan? Because 80 countries it's a huge group. And there is China, I mean, it's like there is the EU, there is the TPP countries because they have a block now because of the TPP e-commerce chapter. There is US, but there is also China, and China has a very different vision. And so we need to call the elephant in the room. And I think they are not ready to call the elephant in the room because they see this as an opportunity, as a hook for the WTO, because WTO is in crisis now. And the US, United States, is undermining the WTO, especially the dispute resolution board. I mean, no one knows what's going to happen in December. But the United States is participating in the GSI. That's how they call it now, Joint Statement Initiative. Everyone is talking about GSI, if we have any acronym there. GSI. So they see this as a hook. But will they get an agreement by the ministerial, NEC ministerial? No. They are talking about streamlining, streamlining tax. Now it's not like a consolidated tax, but more like a tax which is streamlining the proposals on the table. And maybe they will have early harvest provisions, such as the ones that consumer protection or e-signatures, very basic ones. But it seems very, very unlikely that they will get into the controversial issues such as data flows because of the different positions of the countries in the room.
I'd really like to comment on this, so I'm going to take off my moderator hat and say, think about this way, okay? Many of these countries participating do not have data-driven sectors, right? They don't have AI companies. They don't have social networking companies. They don't have the data to build new data-driven services. They don't have the training, and I've written a lot on this at CG. If you're interested, look at data as a development issue, which is a paper I wrote in November. We're also negotiating with the WTO to do a conference on this very topic, but we're also having a conference on this very topic January 31st here at GW called Data is a Development Issue with the Heinrich Böll Foundation and the Center for Global Development. And the idea, and I gave you guys, if you want to read it, a 2-page handout which talks about this new approach which doesn't allow developing countries to trade off. I'm going to give you concessions on steel for concessions on data flows. They all thought they were negotiating e-commerce, but what they are negotiating is digital trade, which is something different, right? As we discussed earlier. And so the question is, if you don't have these sectors, and you don't know how to govern them, what can you do? And what I wrote in that 2-pager is, if you're having digital economy agreements or digital trade, just these sectoral agreements, which 6 countries are now doing, instead of having a trade-off between negotiating other things, that can be great because you might get consensus sooner, right? But it can also be really bad because you're not having that trade-off among sectors. There's no incentives, to some extent, to these developing countries And so they need to really think about it. And the United States should be thinking about what can we do to help these countries. So the capacity building question that you brought up, Rachel, is really important. UNCTAD, by the way, Center for Global Development has a research project that they're just beginning on what should that capacity building look like, funded by Omidyar and others. Omidyar has been training data protection policymakers, as has UNCTAD and the bank, looking at, but what they're not doing, nobody is out there doing, saying to developing countries, here's how you benefit from good governance of data. Here's how your citizens benefit. Here's how you, policymakers, will benefit. There isn't this real understanding, and it seems to me, up to us to push our own government to say this is going to be an important form of international relations, whether it's disinformation or it's protection of personal data. I'll shut up now. Next question.
Got a couple over here. One over here.
Hi, Hannah Monigan, Inside U.S. Trade. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on the previous question, which is talking about the U.S. and the EU and their very different approaches to data, and particularly at the WTO, but just kind of broadly, is there a way forward in sort of marrying those two approaches in a way that the U.S. and the EU can both operate in this space with their two very different approaches to data? Obviously, the WTO is a big one, the e-commerce negotiations, but even more broadly than that in all sort of business and various forums.
Start with that one.
I have no idea.
That's
a very tough
it,
question. But something I observed, we have the EU position, we have the US position, but we also have the TPP position, TPP 11 countries position. So that can be a middle ground for the countries. But I have to say, it's like with the new commission, and the EU is very, very particular on privacy and data protection, and it's a red line for them. I can't really see EU moving on that issue, but I can't really see the US and the others changing their position. And it's something interesting, the TPP countries like Australia, New Zealand, even Japan, they have bilaterals with the EU, and they all agree with the EU position on privacy in their bilaterals. But when it comes to the WTO, they switch back to their TPP position. So it will be interesting for us to see.
And just to add, that I don't disagree that it's a hard issue and one that there might be not a great solution for, but I will bring it back to the interoperability point. Our companies are compliant with GDPR in the EU. They also operate in countries around the world. What's critical to essentially global businesses is having a mechanism in place that they can still process transfer data outside borders as long as it's compliant with the domestic privacy laws. So things like Privacy Shield, like the Europeans just reauthorized last week, I believe. So having those mechanisms in place are critical.
Anybody else? Patrick LeBlanc of the University of Ottawa has a paper which calls for a digital single market among Canada, the US, and the EU on data. And as you know, personal data protection is protected under the exceptions in all trade agreements. And so he builds on that in the paper, and it's at the CG website, LeBlanc. Next question.
Thank you very much. Nawatsu Aoyama from the Asahi Shimbun, a Japanese newspaper. My question is about the U.S.-Japan trade negotiations. The U.S. basically both governments have argued that the U.S.-Japan digital trade agreement is a cutting-edge digital agreement in this field, but compared to the the similar digital provision in the TPP. How much do you think the U.S.-Japan new digital trade agreement is really superior to the provision of the TPP? So basically, Japan, deep down, Japan really wanted the U.S. to come back to the TPP, so it hasn't touted the new U.S.-Japan trade digital agreement is superior compared to the U.S. So, thank you.
Matt?
Thanks for the question. Our view is it's absolutely superior, and I'd love to outline a few ways it is. And many of these, frankly, are, you could say the same about USMCA, because those two, the digital trade chapter in USMCA and in US-Japan, are very, very similar. So just to take a few examples, and we might not all agree that these are good things, but maybe just our point of view, if you look at the commitments on cross-border data flow and on data localization, we thought that the way the rules was written in the US-Japan is a lot crisper than what was in TPP. To get technical, there's this idea of whether you need a necessity test for deviating from the obligation, and that is present in Japan. It was not in the TPP. Some other things. We've all talked about the importance of trust. The provisions in US-Japan are substantially more robust on cooperation on cybersecurity and privacy. And beyond just this sort of hortatory notion that parties should cooperate on cybersecurity, there's a call that they use risk-based principles in doing so. So really trying to put meat on these ideas. And the privacy language is fleshed out a bit more as well. On this area of source code, it goes further in the US-Japan agreement than in TPP, where the parties are explicit in saying we should protect algorithms from unforced disclosure as well. Some other areas that are notable improvements and additions would include on open data, as Rachael mentioned. This is a vital issue for the future of AI, the ability of more people to use more data and have access to it. US-Japan is explicit about that. And perhaps finally, would note that on the area of online interactive services, these are limitations on online intermediaries' liability. That is, there are provisions in the Japan agreement that are not present in TPP. So, all in all, a pretty good deal.
Any other comments on that question?
Yeah, I'd like to comment. Yeah. So TPP builds on, USMCA builds on the TPP, and the US-Japan builds on USMCA. And as Matt mentioned, like there are like some superiorities for them. Yes. Not necessarily for us in the US-Japan FTA, because we talk about interoperability and the regional standards in the privacy provision, like the US-Japan FTA, like, or whatever it is called, like I don't necessarily want to call it as FTA, US-Japan agreement, let's say, it omits all those details, like, the regional rules, like such as the APEC rules, because that was our interpretation of the TPP or interoperability, so it omits those details. And most of the other stuff, there is no exception for data localization, and the privacy exception is as I mentioned, we weren't happy with the TPP exception. Now it got worse for us. So, but it's very interesting because Japan has a very strong privacy rules. Like Japan had the adequacy from the EU. So I don't know how it will work out. And I'm going to Brussels in a few weeks, and I'm gonna ask Europeans what do you think about the US-Japan agreement, because it should be concern for them. Given the privacy exception and the provisions, and Japan has the adequacy from the EU. It's not very clear how it will work out.
Does anyone else want to comment on that? No? Okay, another question?
Hi, I'm Joseph Ricario. I work here in the Department of Research in the Office of the Dean. My question is, I just want your kind of each panelist perhaps general thoughts on cryptocurrencies in the age of digital trade. From somebody who comes from an international affairs background, I find it very interesting how many different actors in the international system have pursued very different ends through cryptocurrencies. So some things that come to mind are terrorist groups using it as a way to make undocumented financial transactions. I believe the Venezuelan government had a plan to introduce a state-issued cryptocurrency once its prior existing currency hit a inflation rate of over 10 million %. And then companies like Facebook coming out with their own different cryptocurrencies. I was just wondering, I think there would probably be a variety of opinions given the diversity of different industries you guys represent, and just a few comments on cryptocurrencies.
Anyone have any comments? That's not our area of expertise.
Yeah, I can comment. I mean, I try to avoid that discussion, and trade negotiators, trade delegates, especially in Geneva, they like to talk about blockchain and cryptocurrencies. It was like one of the hot topics at the WTO public forum. As public citizen, we have a very strong position. My own president testified at the Congress about Facebook Libra. We are not supporting it. We are highly critical. There are lots of issues related to regulations, like the financial regulations, but also privacy and data protection and the future of financial markets. But I have to say there is an interest from the trade negotiators and the trade delegates, and it's interesting to see that some people see the blockchain or the cryptocurrencies as a solution for many of the problems that developing countries have. I still cannot understand how it will work, but yeah, that's an issue, not my expertise, but we are highly critical of it.
So, also very much not my expertise, nor to my knowledge does my employer have a sort of a specific position on any of the current cryptocurrencies. The only piece I want to add is I think it's important when we talk about these things to be careful about how we distinguish between cryptocurrency but the broader concept of blockchain, which is a technology that is applicable far beyond currency, right? And we have seen it's people way smarter than me who are truly innovative technologists within our company looking at innovative ways to better serve people around the world through blockchain technologies for all sorts of applications, and we're very active on building that into our cloud. So just to be careful to make that distinction. Thanks.
We have time for one more question.
Hello, I'm Jack Spilsbury, longtime employee at the State Department and Foreign Service. I want to ask about, or get some comments on the intersection of cybersecurity and digital trade policy. And Microsoft in particular, I think, has been somewhat of an outlier even within industry in acknowledging some of the intersection there and potential need for international agreements that would address that. But I'd also note that cybersecurity also has served as a pretext often for digital protectionism, such as data localization, control restrictions on source code, standards, et cetera. So anyway, just across that range of issues, how you see that connecting, because it seems like a tough one.
Anyone want to take that on?
Just briefly, I would say that not an expert on the specifically cybersecurity agreements, but we strongly support the cybersecurity risk-based language that's been in USMCA and TPP. The point that you mentioned on localization rules being made pursuant to cybersecurity laws, again, we're seeing that especially in a region of concern in China. China passed their cybersecurity law in 2016, and ever since then, there's been different regulations every other month that have been released for draft comment. A number of these take very restrictive views on data localization, restrictive on cross-border data flows, and in that's a region where we don't see it as wanting to protect privacy, but more as a protectionist measure in general. So that's where we see concerns in cybersecurity.
Anyone else?
Sure. Jack, thanks for your leadership over the years at State. You worked for many, many years trying to advance good policies in this area, so thank you for that. Just to note, I think this is yet another area where trade has a role to play, but far from the only role to play. As you indicated, as a company, we've been very supportive of a couple of multilateral cooperation in a couple of ways. One, within the private sector, helped start something called the Cybersecurity Tech Accord. And then among governments and the private sector, we were very supportive of something called the Paris Call for Peace and Security in Cyberspace. Bottom line, there is absolutely a need for governments and the private sector and non-government entities to work together to set norms for behavior in cyberspace. 100% support it. At the same time, there can be a place in the trade rules for calling out when policies are being put in place that are not really about cybersecurity, but maybe more about distorting trade. No question that it is very hard at times to decide what's what, and that's why we would say good for us all to try and work that out so we can try and call one thing one or the other. But that's not to say that it's easy. And as Rachael indicated, there's been some really good work on that on risk-based principles in, like in USMCA. That's the kind of thing that brings me in deeper collaboration with my colleagues who are truly expert on those principles than I ever have been before. All the way of saying we all have a lot more to do together in this area. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that because this is a very important issue, and this is one of the priority issues for us as the consumer advocacy organizations. As TACD, we've been doing research on cybersecurity, and our partners in Europe, they've been ordering connected devices online and checking the security measures. And most of the connected devices we ordered online, they lack basic security features. So we have a problem. We have a consumer problem there, and we definitely want regulations. There should be regulations, guidelines, principles for the connected devices. But self-regulation is not the way to get those regulations. So we want the governments and the companies and the consumer advocacy organizations and researchers and academics, everyone to come together and come up with binding regulations, because there are so many things, so many devices that you can order online, and there are really, really serious security risks. One example is one of our members, Norwegian consumer organization. They conducted they had a huge project on this doll, connected doll, which is called Kilic. And many people buy those dolls for their daughters. It's connected, it talks, and it can give you, you can ask, "How are you, Kilic?" And the Kilic talks back, and you can have conversations with Kilic. But the problem is, when they completed their research, they found out that there is a huge security risk. Anyone can hack, and those dolls that you give to your daughters can be hacked, and any stranger can manipulate your kids. So these are issues for consumers, and the solution is binding rules, not the self-regulation. And that's why we are critical of the USMCA approach.
You're talking about domestic rules or international?
Domestic rules, also the international rules. There are initiatives going on, on cybersecurity. I'm not sure whether they made progress, but most of the goods we ordered online, and particularly coming from China, they lack basic security to protections, and it's an issue and concern for consumers.
Meredith, did you want to add anything? Okay. Well, we've kept you a long time. Thank you. I want to really thank our articulate and generous speakers. Please join me. And thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. Have a great day. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Go Nat. Thanks.
Go Nat.